Our guest is an internationally recognized authority on cancer and the toxic effects of pollutants in the air, water, food, and workplace. He has been researching and fighting these for over 3 decades, and he says we're going about it the wrong way. He has challenged the nation's most powerful chemical industries for their reckless disregard of human health. He has also challenged the federal government's unresponsiveness to cancer prevention, and he has openly challenged the cancer establishment, both the National Cancer Institute and the American Cancer Society. He charges they mislead the public into believing we're winning the war against cancer. He says they grossly exaggerate their efforts to prevent cancer and exaggerate our ability to treat and cure it. He is critical of current health policy on cancer. He says it reflects a conflict of interests and is indifferent to cancer prevention. Our guest is chairman of the newly formed Cancer Prevention Coalition. He says the nation's top cancer policy should be prevention, not just treatment and basic research. Cancer rates have sharply escalated in recent decades. Cancer now strikes more than 1 in 3 and kills more than 1 in 4. At least 500,000 people a year die from cancer. He blames avoidable exposure to carcinogens. Supported by a coalition of leading national experts in cancer prevention and public health, he urges radical changes in federal cancer policies. He emphasizes reduction of avoidable exposures to these carcinogens. His ultimate goal is to win the war against cancer by reducing modern epidemic cancer rates to their pre-1940 levels. He is the author of 6 books, including Hazardous Waste in America and the prize-winning Politics of Cancer. Tonight, our guest will talk about losing the war against cancer. He will examine 2 questions: who's responsible and what can we do about it? It now gives me great pleasure to introduce to you one of America's leading authorities on cancer prevention, Dr. Samuel Epstein.
On our last Healing the Earth show, Dr. Epstein discussed the threat of carcinogens that surround you. Today, he will talk about some hidden causes of breast, lung, and childhood cancers.
Now, I've talked about so far some aspects of the problem, particularly increasing incidence of cancer, static cure rates of cancer, the causes of cancer, examples of preventable, avoidable exposures. Let me now give you a few examples of 3 different cancers: breast cancer, childhood cancers, and lung cancers, and discuss very briefly with you what are some of the unrecognized causes of these cancers. When I say unrecognized, although evidence on these avoidable causes have been known for decades. First of all, as far as breast is concerned, as you know, there has been a major increase in the incidence of breast cancer over recent decades, somewhere in the region of 60% since 1950. Now, what do we know about the causes of breast cancer? The traditional viewpoint is that familial or genetic factors are important, and that's very true. As I said before, if your aunt or maternal aunt or mother had it, your risks of getting breast cancer are increased. In addition, there's reproductive factors. If you don't have children, if you start menstruating very early in life and have a menopause very late in life, in other words, what we call the estrogen window. If the estrogen window is open for a long period of time, you're at greater risk of breast cancer. But however, these risk factors don't explain the fact that we've had this massive increase in breast cancer over the last few decades. And these risk factors, the reproductive and the genetic, can only account or can only be incriminated in about 25% of cancers, of breast cancers. So what is the cause? what are the causes of the other 75%? Now, it so happens that there's a big body of information that's been accumulating over the last 30 years or so on the causes of breast cancer, of which you've probably heard nothing, and which has been totally ignored by all the decision makers that be, ranging from government to industry to the cancer establishment, to the cancer professionals. But let me run through some of the evidence very briefly. From the early 60s onwards, we had developed information that a wide range of pesticides, particularly what we call organochlorine pesticides, DDT, aldrin, dieldrin, chlordane, heptachlor, would produce breast cancers in rodents. And this created, right away, a strong presumption that they would do the same in humans. The evidence was totally ignored. The next line of evidence was developed by the mid-70s, where it was shown that if you examine the breast cancer itself chemically, you do a chemical analysis on the breast cancer and then on adjacent normal tissue, you find very much higher levels of DDT and PCBs in the breast cancer than in the adjacent normal tissue. Again, evidence totally disregarded. Then what happened was, the next thing was what I call the Israeli anomaly. Fascinating story. 1974, I was at Case Western Reserve Medical School. I got a call from a man in Israel who introduced himself. I said, "My name is Jerry Weston. I'm an American who's working in Israel in a public interest group, and I'm very concerned about the extremely high levels of pesticides, particularly DDT, lindane, in dairy products. Israel, being a small country with intensive agriculture, has had very intensive use of pesticides." So he said, "What can you do about it?" So I said, "Well, what have you tried to do in Israel?" He said, "Well, we've been to all the leading cancer authorities, we've been to the Weizmann Institute, and they say, look, it's of no relevance, it's just animal data, we really shouldn't worry about this at all." I then embarked on a series of letter writing and wrote articles for Israeli journals, and the upshot of all of this was, by 1976, we'd forced the Ministry of Health to take strong action to reduce the levels, the very high levels of organochlorine pesticides in dairy products. Okay. What happened after that was phenomenal. About this time, we were seeing a wave of immigrants into Israel, poor people from North Africa, people with a low economic standard who'd come to Israel, and when in Israel, they started having fewer children, they had much more fatty diets, and I forgot to mention before that the common wisdom was that high fatty diets were important as a risk factor in breast cancer. So they had fewer children, they were having high fat diets, all things which, according to the conventional wisdom, you would expect them to have had more breast cancer. But what indeed happened over the succeeding decade was mortality from breast cancer in premenopausal women fell by 30%, which was unique. All over the world, breast cancer mortality was going up, but in Israel, this very sharp decrease. That doesn't prove anything, but it's a line of evidence which you'd be very foolish to disregard. More recently, we've had studies showing that if you study the chemistry of breasts with cancer and compare them with fibrocystic disease or chronic mastitis, you find very much higher levels of DDT and the pesticides in those breasts with the cancer than you do with fibrocystic disease. So all these lines of evidence are accumulating, showing the role of pesticides and PCBs and dioxins in breast cancer. In the meantime, other evidence was accumulating, showing that in certain women working in certain industries had a high rates of breast cancer. At the same time, evidence was accumulating that if you lived near hazardous waste sites, you'd have a higher incidence of breast cancer. At the same time, information was developing that if you lived near civilian nuclear reactors and your water was contaminated with radioactive strontium or iodine, you'd have higher rates of breast cancer, which in my view is probably responsible for the high rates of breast cancer in New York, counties in Suffolk and Nassau County, where some of you may have heard there's high rates of breast cancer. So, all of this information has been developing, none of which you've probably heard of before, and totally ignored by the cancer establishment. Let me give you one other one which will give you a sense of feel of some of the problems we have to contend with. You all know about mammography and the use of mammography for detecting breast cancers, but what you probably don't know about are the hazards of mammography, the ability of mammography to give you breast cancer. Let me just give you a little insight into this. By 1971, the National Academy of Sciences BEIR Committee, or Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation, had surveyed the total world literature on the effects of radiation on the breast and had shown that for every 1 rad exposure, which is a measure of radiation exposure, you would increase breast cancer risks by 1%. 1 rad, 1%. In early '72, the National Cancer Institute and the American Cancer Society embarked on a program known as the Breast Cancer Detection Demonstration Program, in which they enrolled 300,000 women. They told them that mammography is totally safe. They said this will give us a chance of detecting your breast cancer at an early stage if you have it. And the average dose that these women got, it was supposed to have been 2 rads, the average dose was probably 5 rads. 5 rads per mammogram. Now, some women had sometimes 2 or 3 mammograms at a sitting because the first one didn't come out too well, or the radiologist wanted another. So minimally assuming premenopausal women had 5 rads exposure over a 5-year period, this would increase their breast cancer risk by 25%. Now you might say, well, you know, perhaps the National Cancer Institute wasn't aware of this. Well, the fact is this. I have a memorandum from the leading clinician of the National Cancer Institute who handled this program, called Dr. Nathaniel Berlin, who used to till recently headed the Cancer Center at Northwestern Hospital in Chicago, where I happen to live. And the memo goes as follows. Gee whiz, boys. This program is bringing us in a lot of favorable publicity, and we're getting a lot of research funds. Let's carry on with it. This was in response to questions raised internally in internal memoranda to him by people in the National Cancer Institute who worried about the cancer risks of mammography. So they disregarded it and went on with it. What I call white-collar crime in the National Cancer Institute and American Cancer Society, and this is one of the many reasons why I advocate a boycott of the American Cancer Society, but we'll come to that later. Now, to bring this a little more up to date, let me simply point out that at the present moment, that there has never been any evidence of value of mammography for premenopausal women, never any evidence at all. The breast is too dense, and for a variety of reasons, it's of no value. For postmenopausal women, it's essential when you go for mammography, you should go to a center which actually gives you the dosage as opposed to estimated dosage. The levels given now are much less than they were before, but even then, to my mind, there are risks with this. Now, let me move on to childhood cancer. As you know, there's been a major increase in childhood cancer, 20% over the last few decades. This is an expression of the fact that children are very, very sensitive to carcinogens, to carcinogenic pesticides in food, but even more so to the fact that we have now about 20 to 30 studies showing that if your mother or father worked in certain industries during pregnancy, the child's chances of getting cancer of the brain and other sites, there's major increases. So this information, again, has been totally ignored by the cancer establishment. Lung cancer. Most of you think that lung cancer is only due to smoking. And in fact, there is no question that smoking is the very major cause of lung cancer. However, what we've seen in the last few decades is a major increase in lung cancer rates in non-smokers, doubling of the rate of incidence of lung cancer in non-smokers, major increases of lung cancers in workers in a wide range of industries, whether they smoke or not, and a wide range of other lines of evidence making it clear that occupational exposures to carcinogens are an important cause of lung cancer in the same way as urban air pollution is an important cause of lung cancer. And we estimate that up to a third of all lung cancer cases are due to causes other than smoking, again, information which probably you're not aware of. So much for breast, lung, and childhood cancer. Let me finally, before moving on to who's responsible, just tell you what the economic impact of cancer is. It seems somehow crude to talk about the economic impact of a disease which is so hideous, which gives people so much pain and suffering and death, but I think it's important to understand this in terms of the current debate on the healthcare crisis. The official estimates on the costs of cancer are about $110 billion a year, which is about 2% of the GNP, and there's no question this is a massive inflationary impact. The per-case Medicare payments for cancer now exceed those for any other disease. I've taken just about an hour to talk about some of the background facts. I'd now like to turn to the question of who's responsible, and after that, what to do about it. Okay, we're going to try to focus somewhat succinctly, I hope, on the who's responsible. And I think the first and the most important group to focus on is illustrated in the Pogo cartoon. I see the enemy and they is us. In other words, we are responsible for our lack of involvement in critical issues, for having surrendered decision-making to self-interested professionals, to reckless industry, and irresponsible government. So you and I we're going to point the finger at certain groups, but before we point the finger, let's make sure that the finger's also pointed at us. Now, industry. The job of industry is to make money, as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, and damn the consequences. Industry operates on what they call internalized costs. The chemical industry, the mining industries operate on what they call internalized costs. Costs of raw materials, the cost of production, and the cost of labor. What we call the externalized costs, the cost to society and the cost of environment, are not factored into the balance sheet of industry. The job of industry is to provide as much profits as shortly as possible to its shareholders, and the cost to society and the cost to environment are not factored in. So, that is the priority of industry. And accordingly, when evidence accumulated on risks from cancer and other problems of environmental degradation, industry's immediately response is to trivialize the risk, to say the rates of cancer aren't going up, and if they were growing up, it's due to people's own fault. They were smoking too much, they chose the wrong parents, genetic susceptibility, and, anything what we call blame the victim. It's everybody's fault but mine. And then other variations, what they call the cost-benefit analysis. They would say, let's do a cost-benefit analysis on this particular regulation. If we regulate in this way, it's going to cost so much, and what are the benefits to the industry? So the cost and the benefit analysis was done basically in how much it would cost industry, how much it would benefit industry. The cost to society were not factored into this. Instead of saying how much is the benefit to industry and how much is the cost to society, it was skewed in a way in which the cost and benefit was entirely written on the basis of internal industry costs. Sometimes attempts were developed to place a value on human life, and then with a series of rubber numbers, industry was able to persuade certainly the Reagan-Bush administrations that the cost of regulation weren't worth it. Over and above that, industry has a very long record of manipulating information, which I briefly referred to before. There's many tricks to the trade. There's many ways of taking an agent which is a carcinogen and making it appear to be a non-carcinogen by conducting the experiments in such a way. And then if you do get embarrassing data or a chemical which you're interested in being carcinogenic, there's several options open. You can manipulate the data, you can change the numbers, or you can suppress the information, or you can destroy it. And I could keep you here for the next week giving you examples of manipulation, suppression, distortion, and destruction of data. So, the one segment of society to which we clearly have to place the blame is industry. But why did industry behave this way? It's because you, as a society, took the position industry knows what it's doing. Government took a hands-off position. And the cancer establishment, interested in basic research and the treatment of cancer, which was quite ineffectual, really wasn't interested. Then, let's now turn, where I've referred on occasions to the National Cancer Institute and American Cancer Society, what we call the cancer establishment. Their interests, they are fixated on diagnosis, treatment, and basic research. They're indifferent or hostile to prevention. And let me, just to give you, explain this a little more, they explain cancer almost exclusively in terms of blame the victim. They till very recently have trivialized their own government data on increasing cancer rates. And they have paid really no attention to preventing avoidable exposures to carcinogens in air, water, food, and the workplace. Let me throw some figures at you to illustrate this. The budget of the National Cancer Society is $2 billion a year. Your money, taxpayers' money. $1 billion goes on basic research, approximately. And if you actually look at this basic research, it's very difficult to find any relevance to cancer research at all. In fact, I've collected a series of quotations from the leading authorities, molecular biologists in the country on basic research, who say basically, really this has got nothing to do with cancer. It's a jolly good way of getting grant money, and we like what we're doing. We're very interested in basic mechanisms. Well, that's fine. I spend a lot of time in my life doing basic research. I like it. But we don't give the National Cancer Institute $2 billion a year to play around with areas which have nothing to do with cancer. Of the $2 billion budget, till recently the National Cancer Institute claimed that they spend a third on cancer prevention. In fact, the truth is they spend under 50 million, which is 2.5% of the budget, on avoidable exposures to carcinogens in air, water, food, and the workplace. Never in the history of the National Cancer Institute have they gone to Congress and say, we need legislation to phase out these carcinogenic chemicals. Never have they gone to say the public should be informed of cancer-causing chemicals in their food. Never once have they done this. In fact, I could give you a list of actions which are clearly hostile to the cause of cancer prevention. With the American Cancer Society, it's a similar situation, except that for a very substantial amount of the money that the American Cancer Society collects, this is squirreled away into cash assets and real estate holdings, while the senior executives live high off the hog. The National Cancer Institute, in an investigation by the National Institute of Charities and by subsequent national charity investigating bodies, it has been shown that while every year they claim that they have no money for research, they have vast assets which are never made available, and less than $1 out of every $6 goes towards research and patient care. To put give you a little more sense of feel on this, the National Cancer Institute, the policies of the National Cancer Institute are determined by a presidentially appointed 3-member President's Cancer Panel. The last chairman of the President's Cancer Panel for a period of 10 years was Armand Hammer, the CEO of Occidental Petroleum, who gave us, among other things, the Love Canal, and contributed very significantly to the overall burden of carcinogens in the country. The one before that was a man, Benno Schmidt, a New York investment banker with close tie-ins to the cancer drug industry, who stands to make a fortune when any useless cancer drug is put on the market and is sold with profit. So this is the power behind the decision-making. But apart from that, and apart from conflicts of interest, there actually is a professional mindset which is fixated on diagnosis and treatment and really indifferent to cancer prevention. If you look at the latest American Cancer Society facts and figures, for childhood cancers, not a word about prevention, not a word about prevention for breast cancers, other than reference to fatty diet itself, and there is really no relationship between fat itself as opposed to contaminants, in fact, to breast cancer. What about Congress? The problems in Congress are multiple. I always take the position that Congress is the lowest common denominator in American society. Now, I say that not because of the recent trivial scandals with the banking interest and this kind of thing, but largely because Congress in general reflects public trends rather than setting them. Now, I've worked with Congress for 2 decades, and many members of Congress I've worked with are honorable and idealistic and try very hard, but they're, for various reasons, some of which I'll touch on, their task is difficult. One of the reasons why the tasks are difficult is because legislation is so fragmented between different congressional committees. So you can have the same chemical which is legislated in entirely different ways, depending whether it occurs in air, water, food, or the workplace. So there's massive legislative fragmentation, and many of the legislative committees involved in these areas are subject to powerful lobbying, and their chances of re-election are influenced by money they get directly and indirectly from powerful lobbies. So there's a wide range of factors which have limited the ability of Congress. And furthermore, there's been an undue deference to professionalism, to the cancer societies, the National Cancer Institute, and there's been a failure to recognize that we're losing the war against cancer, and what we really need to do is to take radical steps to resolve these problems by phasing out the manufacture, use, and disposal of carcinogens. As far as the administration's concerned, the Reagan-Bush administrations, their major philosophy was one of indifference to public health, environmental concerns, and the major preoccupation was making the wealthy 1% even wealthier still, especially the wealthier 1% who happen to control the major industries in this country. As far as the Clinton administration is concerned, it's too early to say. There are some hopeful signs with the appointments of Donna Shalala, Department of Health and Human Services, Carol Browner, Environmental Protection Agency. There's some hopeful signs, but there's some equally disturbing signs of over-willingness to compromise and lack of ability to express firm leadership on areas that are critical to the health and welfare of this nation. The public we've talked about, the POGO, we've talked about that. To a certain extent, I may have been somewhat harsh, because the public have been deluged in the past with contradictory with information, with the Madison Avenue type hype from the American Cancer Society, from the National Cancer Institute, etc. So there's been a great deal of confusion, but what we're beginning to see now is a new consciousness, the consciousness of the 1990s. As far as the church is concerned, I will say very clearly that with rare exceptions, organized religion, the Jewish, the Catholic, the Protestant, the Methodist, the mainline religions have not taken a significant or an important role in these areas which are critical to the health and welfare of our nation.
You're watching Healing the Earth, presented by Elizabeth Clare Prophet, world-renowned author and founder of Summit University. Summit University is located at the beautiful Royal Teton Ranch in Park County, Montana, just north of Yellowstone National Park. For more information, call 1-800-245-5445. That's 1-800-245-5445.
What to do about it falls into two main types of considerations. First, what you can do on the personal level, what you can do to protect yourself and your family, and secondly, what you can do on the broader societal and political levels. Now, as far as the personal level, I think there's no better way of expressing efforts to protect yourself than what is represented by the gathering here this evening in this Healing of the Earth conference. Your lifestyle is as fine as it could be and should be. You don't smoke, at least I don't think you do. You eat organic produce, or largely organic produce. You produce meat which you don't eat yourselves, but this meat is produced without antibiotics, without carcinogenic hormones. You live in a place, your Mrs. Prophet has chosen for you a place to live which is far from any major industries. I'm not saying that this area is totally environmentally safe. There are some problems, but as far as possible, this is one of the safest areas in the country you can live. You're not living under the pall of tons of toxic emissions from nearby industries. And none of you, to my understanding, work in hazardous occupations where you're exposed to toxic and carcinogenic chemicals. So on the personal level, I think really you're doing just about everything that you can do. However, these options, these personal options, are somewhat limited. You cannot control the fallout from your air, from states nearby. You cannot control some problems of water pollution. You cannot control pesticide use in neighborhoods near you. You cannot control pesticide use in those foods which you are forced to buy, which are not organic, but you grow most of your own foods, but some foods, unfortunately, you cannot grow. It's not possible for reasons of soil and climate to grow them here. So for this reason, and also the fact that your church has inculcated in you a sense of social responsibility, this means that you have to become interested and concerned in other ways in which you can involve yourself on the broader national level. And let's talk about some of these ways in which you can involve yourself. Now, there's many different ways of doing this. You can do this on a small scale level, or you can do this on a large scale level. There's an old saying in the environmental movement, act locally and think globally, which isn't a bad way to start off. In other words, in the community you happen to be living in, take any issue that seizes you, that you think is important, and concentrate on it, read up about it, and then talk to your friends and create a small group that will focus on this. Let me give you a few examples. You go to the local supermarket and say, look, we like the supermarket, we enjoy coming here, but we think we have the right to know when we buy crops, when we buy vegetables or produce, what pesticides they've been grown with, or what carcinogenic pesticides they've been grown with. And you'll get one of two responses. The supermarket manager will say, go to hell, which is one response, in which case your response is the next day to boycott, to have pickets outside the supermarket. Joe Blow will not tell us, will not give us the information on what carcinogenic pesticides. You can invent all kinds of creative ways of handling this. On the other hand, you may be surprised. The supermarket manager will say, look, I think you're absolutely right, and I've been concerned about this. Why don't I start doing this? Why don't I start, first of all, by exploring what organic produce is available, and then, once I find what organic produce is available, getting affidavits from the farmers that grow these crops, to declare under oath, a notarized oath, that these crops have been grown without carcinogenic pesticides, and to have spot checks, spot analyses of these foods to make sure that nobody's cheating. There's nothing like somebody looking over your shoulder to stop you cheating. Then that supermarket manager will have, next to the apples, a statement: these apples have been grown without carcinogenic pesticides. He'll have it with with the apples. He'll go from the apples to the vegetables to the wide range of other things. So this is one way in which you can do it. Now he'll say to you, well, you realize you've got to pay 10 cents more a pound if you buy this. Then you say, okay, I'm willing to do that. And I think most of us would be willing to do that. So what I'm talking about is the exercise, your belated exercise of a fundamental right in democracy, the right to know. And this is something which is fundamental and could have a ripple effect in communities all over this country and in countries all over the world. The next stage in all of this could be, or another stage, or a parallel stage, is to demand to the federal government, to demand to FDA, why isn't foodstuff labeled for carcinogenic pesticides, for carcinogenic growth hormones in meat, and for antibiotics in meat? There is, as you know, a Federal Nutritional and Labeling Act, which the FDA has been pushing for the last 2 years, saying that you have to label food for their content of fat and for nutrients and what have you. But they've stayed away very, very carefully from coming to grips with an even more important issue of the toxic and carcinogenic chemicals in your foodstuffs. So you can approach this, on the one hand, either by sending letters from your group to the FDA and with copies to the media, putting pressure on your local representative, your state representative, and if he doesn't respond, make sure that he's kicked out at the next election. Sending this to your state, to your congressman and senator, and building up an array of strategies from, on the one hand, the very small, limited approach to the supermarket on the one hand, to the approach on the state and on the federal level and the administration. So these are a wide range of options. We're talking about boycotts. I do think that boycotts of the local American Cancer Society would be a very, very useful way of expressing your concern and to ensure that the money that you give, or have been given perhaps, to the American Cancer Society, go to a local environmental group or be earmarked to your church for particular use in to fight for their environmental concerns, whether they be cancer or otherwise. Now, perhaps an even more important activity to be conducted on a local level is spreading the word around that we are losing the war against cancer. The cancer rates are escalating. We have no ability to treat and cure cancer, greater now than we had a few decades ago, and that cancer is essentially a preventable disease. That educational aspect should begin in school, should extend to communities, and should be the motivating force behind all other campaigns. Now, how eventually does one translate these concerns to producing radical reforms in the way we govern ourselves as a nation? And I think there's two different kinds of approaches that have to be thought about. The first is based on this whole concept of right to know, that once indeed you do know or are given information as to the presence of what carcinogens there are in your air, your water, your food, in the workplace. For instance, a community can say, we want to know what are the levels of carcinogens in our drinking water, we want to know the levels of carcinogens in air, we want to know what the levels of carcinogens in household products, consumer products, and in fact in California there is a law modeled after this kind called Proposition 65. Once you were told this, once you know that you're exposed to these avoidable carcinogens. A worker wants to know what carcinogen he's exposed to. Immediately, this creates a powerful head of pressure in your community to move for action to remedy the situation. Now, what action can be taken to remedy the situation? The action that can be taken is to develop legislation to phase out the manufacture, use, and disposal of all carcinogens, synthetic, organic, industrial carcinogens, and to replace them with non-carcinogenic alternatives. For the overwhelming majority of uses of carcinogens, there are non-carcinogenic alternatives, which in some instances initially may be more expensive, but with an economy of scale, one can reduce, once they become more used, one can reduce their costs and they could be then made competitive. Now, how do you go about doing this? You can't legislate the marketplace into suddenly taking actions that are non-profitable to itself, or that will create more costs, even although these costs will be passed on to the consumer. The way you go about it is by developing, in parallel with the legislation, by developing what's called marketplace pressures. You create economic incentives to responsible industry, to those industries that say we're willing to phase out the use of carcinogenic pesticides, we're willing to move away from feedlot practices in which we pump our cattle with antibiotics and growth hormones and tranquilizers in feedlots. So you say to them, you move away from these into other forms of agriculture and meat production, and we will give you a tax incentive to do that. You say to those industries that are resistant to replace their carcinogenic processes, techniques, products, that we will create a tax penalty for you if you persist in these activities when there are alternatives, safe alternatives available. So by the combination of marketplace pressures and also by legislation, one can create a climate in which over the next decade we can gradually phase out the whole large-scale use of these toxic and carcinogenic chemicals, which over and above the focus of the evening being cancer, over and above the epidemic of cancer, which we're talking about, and hopefully which we can return cancer rates to pre-1940 levels, will reduce immune disease, reproductive disease, neurobehavioral disease, will rid ourselves of the threat to the integrity of groundwaters, of deep aquifers, will create an opportunity for the restoration of forms and species of life which are becoming extinct due to toxic chemicals. So there's a wide range of benefits which are almost immeasurable, which can result from such activities. So what I say to you is that even although you feel secure in your own personal life, certainly while you're here, when you go back to your own homes, you will not feel so secure. You will not be living in a sheltered, protected environment. Whatever steps you can take to protect yourself will be important, but they will not protect you. They will only partially protect you. And that there's a bigger world in which you live. None of us are an island unto themselves. None of us wish to be an island to themselves. Each of you in your own crusade for the sanctity of life, for the message of your church, should realize that these messages encompass messages other than the purely spiritual. They encompass messages which are ethical, which impinge on the political, and these political decisions impinge on your future lives and the future lives of your children and grandchildren. Now, I've rushed through the latter part of my talk a little, and I've had a little more time than I thought I would have, which gives us the added advantage of allowing me to respond more fully to any questions that might surface, and I'll be delighted to attempt to cope with any that have surfaced. Thank you for your attention. What about alternative healing methods? Let me simply say that the National Cancer Institute, oh, I missed one out. The National Cancer Institute and the American Cancer Society have kept what's called a quack list, what they call a quackbuster list, that is, of people who practice alternative or innovative therapies. Now, there is no question that the alternative and innovative therapy embraces a very wide spectrum of different approaches. And in it, there's a large element of quackery, but there's a large element also of honest, reliable information which has surfaced from honest clinicians in different parts of the country who have treated patients and have come up with very successful results on an individual basis. But this information has never been adequately tested because the National Cancer Institute has refused to allow such testing. To cut a very long story short, in 1986, a group of 40 congressmen put pressure on what's called the Office of Technology Assessment, that's a congressional advisory office, to examine the efficacy of alternative therapies. Initially, they tried to produce a report which damned them all out of hand, but eventually they were forced to produce a more honest report which finally concluded that there are somewhere in the region of 200 alternative therapies which are deserving of careful attention and which are deserving of clinical trial. And you see, before you market a drug, the drug has to go through clinical trials which are sponsored, approved and paid for by the National Cancer Institute, sometimes in combination with industry, and the industry actually producing the money which the National Cancer Institute uses to pay for it, and then the FDA approves for the drugs. Now, if no cancer drug industry will pay for the trials, and the National Cancer Institute won't, there's no chance of ever getting that drug approved. So when the OTA report, Office of Technology report, went to the National Cancer Institute, the National Cancer Institute said, yes, these drugs may well be useful, but that's all they've done. They haven't undertaken a single clinical trial. The result being that the National Institutes of Health recently set up an office with a budget of $1 million to examine further the utility of some of these alternative drugs. The final upshot of all of this is nothing is really going to happen except committee work until the public realizes the cancer treatment for the overwhelming majority of all cancers is totally useless, and that in fact there's every reason to examine critically those forms of cancer therapy, of innovative or unorthodox cancer therapy, which have been shown to be of promise. And I think a very significant number have been shown to be of promise. Is there any way we can protect our families from pesticides on our produce? Does Clorox bars remove pesticides? It depends what the pesticides are. Post-harvest pesticides, pesticides which are used after the fruit and vegetables have really come up and ready for harvest, and are applied on the exterior, you can in fact remove a certain amount of them, the ones that haven't penetrated to the skin, by washing, particularly by letting them soak for a period of time with water with a small amount of soap or detergent. A wide range of pesticides, however, are applied pre-harvest, and they're translocated, means go up through the roots and into the body of the fruit or produce, and nothing can be done about them. Well, there's a lot of questions on alternative therapies. Over dinner this evening, we were talking about one particular chemical, which is known as hydrazine, which in research about 30, 40 years ago at the Sloan Kettering, a Japanese researcher called Sugiura found was remarkably effective in curing cancers, in actually producing cures of cancers in mice. However, this is a long story, and I'll try to condense it. His attempts to publicize this information got absolutely nowhere, and hydrazine was put on the blacklist or the quack list by the American Cancer Society, largely because it was a cheap drug. No drug industry, it couldn't be patented. No cancer drug industry could make a killing out of it. So there was nothing in it for the industry. If there was nothing in it for the cancer drug industry, the National Cancer Institute wouldn't pay for the trials. But about 2 years ago, under great pressure, limited trials were conducted with hydrazine, and it was found to be probably the most single effective agent in producing prolonged remissions, relatively prolonged remissions in lung cancer. So here we have a drug which was non-patentable, unorthodox or innovative, on the quack list for so long, but has turned out to have a value, one of the few drugs that has value in lung cancer. Have there been any major successes in ridding of carcinogens in the environment in recent times? How did they achieve it? For positive examples will prove inspirational. Let me give you a trivial one. I mentioned very briefly Proposition 65, which was a proposition in California in 1986, which basically said any manufacturer of a product which contains carcinogens has to label that product accordingly, and any industry that knowingly discharges into air or water chemicals that can induce cancer or reproductive effects has to provide this information to the public, to state agencies, and the state agencies have to provide this information to the public. And if any state official fails to provide this information to the public, that state official can be jailed and fined, which is a damn good idea. Because the general tendency of bureaucrats is to hide things in files for fear of not rocking the boat. Okay, but after that, industry then, but prior to the passage of Proposition 65, industry preached gloom and disaster to say this is going to be major upheaval. In fact, in the Bush administration, the Council of Economic Advisors in 1989, they did an economic analysis of the impact of Proposition 65 in California and came to the conclusion that the impact was trivial. To give you the little trivial example I was going to talk about, those of you who do their own typing and still use typewriting machines as opposed to word processors will probably use whiteout. Now, whiteout, till very recently, contained perchloroethylene as the solvent. Perchloroethylene is a highly carcinogenic material, and if you'd be splashing this around on paper the whole time, you'd be breathing it in. Well, all that happened was after Proposition 65 was passed, other solvents were used, ranging from acetone and that kind of thing, which were non-carcinogenic and didn't cost anything at all. Talking about perchloroethylene, one use that needs to be phased out right away, when you take your clothes to be dry cleaned, they're dry cleaned in a vapor of perchloroethylene inside tanks. After they go out from the tanks, the tank is evacuated and fresh air is recirculated, which gets rid of a lot of it. However, if you take 2 or 3 suits home, hang them in a cedar closet, you'll get levels of perchloroethylene will degas from those clothes, and you'll get levels of perchloroethylene in that cedar closet which are higher than the permissible levels for workers who are protected with respirators. There are other examples of ridding of carcinogens, and we're seeing this in the whole of the organic market. There have been a series of studies that show you can get similar agricultural productivity by the use of integrated pest management and organic techniques. And although there may be a cost differential, and we're seeing now the growth of the organic food industry. We're seeing now there is a meat producer called Coleman Meat's the only meat producer in the country that actually processes its cattle through feedlots, but does not use any chemicals at all, no tranquilizers, no antibiotics, no growth hormones, and his meat is sold as organic meat. It costs a little bit more, it's leaner, and that's an example of one manufacturer doing that. He's struggling to keep afloat. If indeed he got a tax incentive, it would make life easier for him, as it would for the whole of the organic meat, for the organic market.
You've been watching Dr. Samuel Epstein talk about losing the war against cancer, who's responsible, and what to do about it. Dr. Epstein gave this presentation at Healing the Earth, a 10-day conference conducted by the renowned author and spiritual leader Elizabeth Clare Prophet. This program was presented as a public service by Summit University, Box 5000, Livingston, Montana, 59047, 5000. For more information, call 1-800-245-5445 or write this address. For a free book by Elizabeth Clare Prophet, or for more information about her teachings on the world's major religions, call 1-800-245-5445. That's 1-800-245-5445.